Hello and welcome back to Worms. Today we are playing the best Worms game of them all, baby. We're playing Worms Reloaded. I'm sorry I called you baby. Now, of course, last week we played Worms Armageddon, which I acknowledged as being the Worms that the most amount of people called their favourite Worms. But this week we're playing Worms Reloaded, which is what the most amount of people who are me call the best Worms game, and I will explain why. But first of all, I would just like to acknowledge that this is episode 333, and we are playing the third game in the Worms series, or the third, it's not the third game in the Worms series, really, but it's like the third main 2D Worms game, so it counts, damn it. And I will also point out that the teams we've got this time are different zones in the different MMOs. This time, instead of Guild Wars 2, we have RuneScape, because these are teams I already made, and I think I already used them in a weekly Waypoint episode long ago. But yes, continuing on with the theme of our Worms team names, we are continuing to do MMO related things. So, Worms Reloaded is pretty much a port and combination of the games Worms Open Warfare 1 and 2 for the PSP. I did consider showing you Worms Open Warfare, but I went back and I loaded it up, and it really is just the same game with less stuff in it at a lower resolution. But when I was a kid, I was lucky enough to own a Sony PSP, and honestly my most played game on that device was probably Worms Open Warfare. I loved the shit out of Worms Open Warfare for the PSP. Think about it, it's the perfect handheld game. You know, you sit on the sofa, you're watching TV with your family or whatever, and you're just playing Worms on your little PSP. It was such a good time, dude. I don't think I got Worms Open Warfare 2, or if I did, I didn't play much of it. But Worms Open Warfare also had a version on DS, and I think I owned that too, but it just wasn't as good. Mind you, I am now thinking about it for the first time. I am kind of fascinated to go back and have a look at the DS version of Worms Open Warfare. Maybe we'll do that one day. But Worms Open Warfare 2 was a very iterative sequel, basically just added a few more weapons and a few more maps. And you know, there may be small details that I'm not aware of like, oh, this weapon doesn't exist in Worms Reloaded, but I would be surprised to hear it. The Wikipedia entry for Worms Reloaded also mentions that it was largely based on Worms 2 Armageddon for the Xbox Live Marketplace released in 2009. Now you might be thinking, we just played Worms Armageddon and this is nothing alike. No, Worms 2 Armageddon is basically this game as well. The Worms franchise is a mess, man. In fact, Worms 2 Armageddon on the Xbox Live Marketplace was in turn a follow-up of Worms on the Xbox Live Marketplace, which was released in 2007, which in turn was a port of Worms Open Warfare for the PSP. We don't need to get... Whoa, what? We don't need to get bogged down in the details. But for my money, Worms Reloaded has the best art style, the most variety in terms of level themes and things you can do with them. I wouldn't be surprised if Worms Armageddon just had more overall, like, weapons and stuff, but it's the kind of thing I can't quite put my finger on. I've been thinking about it for a week, but I can't quite put my finger on why I prefer Worms Reloaded to Worms Armageddon. Is it a purely visual thing? I don't think so. But, like, Worms, in terms of gameplay, hasn't changed much since the first iteration, has it? But I think what it really comes down to is, I first played Worms on the PS1. I first played the original one, we talked about that. Then I didn't like the sequel because it was too different, and I think some of the default settings were a bit weird, and we talked about that. So I kind of skipped that one in terms of playing it a lot, and then I got Worms Open Warfare for the PSP and played the shit out of it. And as I've already mentioned, this is a port of Worms Open Warfare to an extent. So I think it just comes down to nostalgia and the Worms that I played the most of. But at this point, I even have nostalgia for Worms Reloaded itself, because I think it's the first Steam game I ever bought. When I was old enough to start having my own money, I downloaded Steam, opened up an account, and the first thing I saw was that the entirety of the Worms franchise was on sale for like £2 per game, and I was like, whoa, that's cheaper than any game I've seen before in my entire life, and I like Worms. Obviously, I wasn't that aware of Steam sales back then. But yeah, I have a lot of fond memories of Worms Reloaded. Like, A lot of those memories are just combined with Worms Open Warfare memories, and I suppose this does lose some points because it's not a handheld game. Well, I guess it could be these days with Steam Deck. I don't know if it's Steam Deck verified or not, but I don't have one of those. But I played this one online with friends, as you're kind of supposed to play Worms. You're not really supposed to play it against yourself, which is something I enjoy doing. But for the first time in my life, I didn't have to rely on a family member being willing to play Worms with me. I had other friends online, like my friend Cammy, who we played a whole bunch of Worms together. I did grab this for Reese when it was on sale for like £2 again once, but for some reason, I don't know if the netcode has gone to shit and they've just never patched it, or if it was something to do with one of our internets, but unfortunately it was unplayable. Like, we would sit there and watch the timer count down to 0, and then someone's worm would move all at once in a few seconds, and yeah, it was bad. But yeah, if you were to ask me on a random day, do you want to play Worms, and we both had access to every single Worms title to ever exist, which Worms title would I pick if you gave me the option? Probably Worms Reloaded. Although, you know, if we both owned every Worms, I wouldn't say no to the original. Been a long time since I got to play the original Worms with somebody. But no, Worms Reloaded is by and large my favourite, and I feel like I've probably hammered that point home by now. If Worms Reloaded is also your favourite Worms game, feel free to let me know, because I only ever see love for Worms Armageddon out there, and damn it, tell me I'm not alone in this. After this entry, it does get a bit more gimmicky, so, you know, I do get the impression that maybe with Worms Reloaded, a lot of people were like, why did we need another Worms game when it does exactly the same as what Armageddon does? But, yeah, whatevs. How dearie me. As I watch this match back, I am reminded of this thought I've been having for a while of like, I would like to do some sort of series which is just recording Worms matches, but I feel like a lot of the content you see based around Worms is friends playing it together and it being hilarious because they're bad at Worms. But the kind of content I want to make is for teams and like the emergent narrative that takes place in a Worms game as the battlefield shifts and changes with artillery explosions and people die in interesting ways, etc. Don't get me wrong, I'd like to do Worms with friends as well and it be a hilarious experience. That could be Dimension Jam, but just in terms of like, I've named these Worms these different names, and it's interesting to see, you know, Worm A destroy Worm 3, and that's funny and interesting because they're named after these characters, etc. Am I the only one who finds that stuff interesting? Because I would love to do a series which, it might not even have commentary, just Worms games. Maybe I should make a YouTube channel and call it Just Worms Games. I don't know how interesting that would be to watch. Maybe it's more interesting to play than watch, but yeah, it's the kind of thing I'm still trying to figure out in my head as to like how I could do something like that. Or like, you know how Yogscast have an entire channel dedicated to them playing Civilization? And it's just called Civilization. I would like to have a channel dedicated to just playing Worms with people, and it's just called Worms. Maybe it's already been done. I don't know. I asked Reese over there if he wanted to do a podcast entirely based in Worms, and he was like, yeah, we could play WoW and stuff. I was like, nope, that's not what I'm getting at. Like, all of the best collaborators, I put forth my idea and then threw out a hard no when the idea was changed. Anyway, I think that's enough Worms talk. If I say the word Worms one more time, I'm gonna turn into a bloody worm. Oh dear. Anyway, what have I been playing this week? Well, it's been a pretty busy week. So mostly I've just been sticking to Guild Wars 2. I didn't play any Guild Wars 2 yesterday because I kind of recognized that I needed a break from it. By the way, I did play more than just Guild Wars 2. We'll get to that in a bit. But I have now finished Living World Season 2 and started the Heart of Thorns expansion. And I will not give any spoilers as to anything that happened in Living World Season 2 or even the premise for Heart of Thorns or anything like that. But I had about 111 hours logged into Guild Wars 2 by the time I started its first expansion. I had a good old MMO problem where we care about previous expansions, unlike WoW. It has benefits and it certainly has drawbacks. Although in Guild Wars 2's credit, once you hit level 80, you can just do whatever the hell you want. You can skip expansions if you want to, and you don't need to buy the ability to do so. You just need to own the later stories. But I am very much a story guy, so no matter how much I want those dragons and those tigers and those roller beetles, I'm sticking to it, damn it, and I'm continuing my journey through the story. and its highs and its lows. Broadly speaking, in terms of story, I don't think I talked about this last week, despite talking about Guild Wars 2. Base game story, I think it's got an interesting introduction because it's a lot more like character focused for like the first 30 or 40 levels, I want to say, in terms of like, not only do you have your racial starting zones, but you also have like, you choose a background for your character and it affects some of the quests you do. I think that's really cool and it encourages a lot of alting. But yeah, the base game story does kind of wax and wane, and at its best, it's probably the least interesting stuff. Why do MMOs always have this problem? Final Fantasy XIV has this problem too. You just gotta play for 100 hours and then it gets really good, guys. Just give it 100 hours, it's fine. But yeah, Living World Season 1 is a bit of a weird one because it's technically remastered content that they released recently because it had originally been removed from the game. But Season 1 and 2 together, I would say, do a great job of like slowly making me care. I do that thing where one of the characters is in danger and I go, oh no, and then I go, wait, oh no, oh, I care. When did this happen? Same thing happened to me with the Scions of the Seventh Dawn in Final Fantasy XIV. And I would say if we're going to compare like levels of interest with the story, I would say we're still at like late Realm Reborn levels of like, I like it, I'm into it, I care, but it's not the craziest thing. My biggest problem with the game's narrative is that the biggest threat we face in terms of the Elder Dragons, they're not really characters, they're more kind of, you know, forces of nature in terms of like the fact that they're up to their shenanigans and we've got to try and survive them. They don't have any motivations, they don't have a voice, they don't have any characteristics, and I do wish that they did, because while character-based villains, which is a term I've never had to say before, do pop up and can be great, a lot of the time I do just kind of feel like I'm fighting against, it's not nature, but it feels like I'm fighting against nature and there's not really any villain to frown at, and so far that hasn't changed. However, I will say going into Heart of Thorns, it's definitely like you can tell more time and care and budget has gone into it. Like Living World Season 2 introduced 2 new zones, and they were fun and fine, but they didn't feel like a massive step up over what we already had. They definitely felt a little bit different in terms of like design intent and stuff, but they didn't feel like Heart of Thorns feels. I've entered the first Heart of Thorns zone and immediately I am like, wow. Firstly, it's a jungle biome, and I don't tend to love jungle biomes in MMOs or in games in general, but this does a really good job of making it feel like an actual jungle. Not that I've been in them, but like, you know, I've been to zoos where they've created the same kind of atmosphere, and I don't know how they do it, but it actually feels like you're in this humid, oppressive jungle that's also like really vibrant and beautiful and interesting to explore. But this is also when they introduced the masteries system, and while they retroactively applied that to Tyria with like 3 different masteries you can go and level up, they're kind of like, you know, a little vague, a little like, oh, this thing affects fractals, this thing affects legendary crafting, which you're not even really doing yet, and the other one, I don't even remember what it does. I have been leveling them, but it's definitely not something I've been putting a lot of thought into, whereas the masteries in Heart of Thorns are very much like, you get your glider, you level this masteries up to change the things you can do with your glider. There are bouncing mushrooms around the world, and like, leveling up this mastery, loud car, will affect like what you can do with the bouncing mushrooms and stuff like that. There's this faction in the world, like instead of reputation, it's kind of like a mastery, like, oh, you want to be able to understand what they're saying? Level this mastery. I really, really, really dig it as a method of horizontal progression, and just knowing that this is going to apply to the different mounts when I get to Path of Fire is really fun to think about too. I like the glider a lot more than I thought I would. It's nice to have this thing where I'm like, oh, I've earned this, and it's a thing I can do now to traverse the world in a slightly different way. Plus, back when Heart of Thorns Deluxe Edition was on sale for like 600 gems or something super cheap, I did grab that. So I've got the cool green looking glider. I think the glider they give you with the base expansion is purposefully really dull looking and shit, and I wish they hadn't done that. But yeah, I've barely stepped into Heart of Thorns, but I do really like what's on offer here so far. But yeah, I did consciously decide to give it a little break yesterday, despite having, you know, free time yesterday to play games, because I've been going a little bit hard on Guild Wars 2 and I don't want to burn out on it just yet. So I did play some other games too. We can talk World of Warcraft. I'm still playing The War Within. I'm still having a lovely time. I have unlocked W.O.R.M. I suppose this is also the first week since they finished the endgame campaign story, so we can talk a little bit like about that without talking spoilers. But just in terms of was there a conclusion? Was it interesting? Do I feel like I have all the answers I would have wished for? Firstly, yes, it was surprisingly conclusive. It felt like it had an end, which sounds like a very low bar to cross, but trust me, we haven't had that before a lot of the time with these campaigns. A lot of the time these like end game campaigns have been like, and now we have to do the raid, and then you wait for the raid to release, and then you don't even get to do it really properly as an LFR player until like 2 months down the line, and by that time you've stopped playing WoW and you're playing another game, and the raid cinematic has already been data mined and shared ahead of time, and there's no context for it and everyone hates it. This time around, the raid feels like it's still important. It feels like it's one part of a story that's gonna reach conclusion when we do it, but it doesn't feel like everything is hinging on it. Instead, it ended with like a fun kind of scenario and some cool story, a nice endgame moment, and I feel satisfied, which I normally do not. There are still a lot of questions I have about the things that have been presented to us, to the point where it does feel a little bit frustrating, because I feel like a lot of the things that we see through the leveling experience that are shown to us as, whoa, what's going on here, is still a lot like, we still don't know what's going on here. And as I keep saying, maybe a lot of that stuff is in side quests I haven't quite got around to yet, but at the same time, if it's that important, maybe it shouldn't be in a side quest. Like, I still don't know what's going on with Belladar, you know? Like, there have been allusions to what's going on with Belladar, but mostly that story has been focused on how it affects the culture of people who live in its light, which is good and necessary and needs to happen, but at the same time, I'm like, we better not just be leaving that. You know, I think a lot of this comes from, like, distrust of the WoW writers from over the years. I'm still worried that we're just going to leave things unanswered for years. Because think about it, like, you know, the next big story patch, I assume we're going to a new zone, so yeah, anyway. But yeah, I unlocked my Irvin, is the thing I was initially going to talk about, and so I've made 2 Irvin. I have made Conduit, and I have made Rubido. Conduit is a name I can't quite believe I got, is my enhancement shaman, because everyone is going to make an enhancement shaman for their Irvin. It's just the obvious choice with the Storm Riders and stuff. But I've been leveling him by just taking him through the Cataclysm Eastern Kingdom zones and just like face rolling all the dwarf zones without reading any of the text because I've read it 1,000 times before. It's been a while since I've done that, and it's so satisfying to do. It's just a nice like turn your brain off and listen to a podcast gaming experience. I am currently level 25. I haven't got all that far in the leveling experience yet. I know I could do it a lot faster if I spammed dungeons, but after the WoW Remix Pandaria event, and after the pre-patch leveling craze as well, it is nice to kind of like have the old leveling pacing back and having an excuse to do these old quests again while you listen to a podcast, because that is one of my favourite things to do in WoW. And by the way, Enhancement Shaman, pretty fun. Now, the last game I've played this week is a game called Warhammer 40k Inquisitor. For those of you who don't know, Warhammer 40k Inquisitor is basically their Diablo style, like isometric ARPG. It came out in 2018, and so far from what I've played of it, it is a solid 7 out of 10, which is not an insult. It's also not unexpected. It is a game that, if I didn't know any better, I would swear was developed around 2013 or earlier. But that is not a bad thing either. Some of it feels a little outdated, some of it feels a little crusty, but at its heart, it's a really fun game and a fun way to experience a little bit more of the Warhammer 40k world. Basically, I saw a lot of people playing Space Marine 2, and I went, oh, I can't justify that purchase. But Warhammer 40k Inquisitor is on sale for £8, and I've been thinking about that game a lot. I don't know how much of that game I'm going to play, but I've enjoyed my time with it. I just finished Chapter 1, and yeah, the kind of like crunchiness of that game does kind of like For instance, it takes a really long time to load up. That's my main problem. And it's like 80 gigabytes and it doesn't look like it should be. But it does some cool stuff like, I think there are 7 seasons, but instead of them being like, oh, we did this season once and you had to be there for it, you can just roll a character through any of those seasons. And that's something Diablo 4 really, really needs to do, but won't because FOMO sells. So, that's what I've been playing this week. I hope you have had a good week, and I hope you have enjoyed this video, and I hope you will have an even better week. Thank you for tuning in. See you next time.